the Patriot Act good for America? We're talking about the controversial legislation and more coming up next on Platform. Stay tuned. Good evening and welcome to Platform. I'm your host, Nancy Chin. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to introduce our guests for the evening.
Hello, I'm Daniel McEntee. I'm a junior, and I majored in classics and also in political science.
I'm James White. I'm a senior, and I'm a public relations major.
I'm Jonathan Wilbanks. I'm a freshman, and I'm majoring in business and cinematic arts.
Hi, I'm Shirin Tagarobi. I'm a sophomore and an international relations and broadcast journalism major.
All right, well, thanks for being here tonight, guys. The Patriot Act, passed right after 9/11, has been controversial since its inception. The law allows the government increased access to private information, but has many people questioning the line between intruding on privacy and helping America. I'd like to ask you, do you think that the Patriot Act has made America safer?
Well, we know that terrorists are constantly targeting the U.S., and there has not been a major terrorist attack on U.S. soil since 9/11. So obviously whatever provisions the government has put in place right now, including the Patriot Act, have been to a large extent effective. We know that the Patriot Act led to stopping the attack on the New York subway system that was going to bomb the sewers and flood the subway system with water, which would have killed far more people than 9/11 did. It was successful in stopping the JFK oil pipeline bombings, which, granted, those people were a little crazy and it probably wouldn't have been a big success. We did stop that before anything was able to happen. So there are very clear instances where the Patriot Act has helped keep us safe as Americans.
Yeah, the problem, though, is that there are so many instances in which it is not, which it does the opposite. And I think that it's hard to say, yes, it may have led to the prevention of this bombing or that bombing and the arrest of, 200 or 300 people, but I don't know if that can necessarily be considered, successful.
And
I was just going to say that I just don't think that, along those lines, that it is breaching on all these civil liberties of so many American people. I don't think it justifies the law, or the act, even if it has been successful.
in line with what Shireen was saying, an example of where the Patriot Act has failed, there was a man that was indicted by the U.S. government for involvement in the Madrid bombings in 2004, and it turns out he had nothing to do with them, and after being forced by a court, the U.S. issued an apology to the man and his family, but now that man has been branded for the rest of his life as a potential terrorist. If he tries to go get a job, his employer Googles his name, terrorist. He moves into a neighborhood, his neighbors Google his name, terrorist. So that's going to haunt that man for the rest of his life. So there are definitely areas where the Patriot Act has failed.
But any program is going to have a certain amount of false positives. It's just
Certainly
inherent in the nature of something like this. And it's just, are you willing to trade X amount of lives from some sort of terrorist attack versus people's liberties that are being infringed upon, or they feel that they're being negatively impacted by the law?
And we have detained 300, we have convicted 300 terrorists under the provisions of the U.S. Patriot Act. You figure 9/11 was carried out by 11 men. This is 300. So what have we prevented by keeping these men behind bars?
At the same time, and maybe this goes beyond the Patriot Act, but we don't know what kind of methods the government uses. When they detain someone, there could be all sorts of, I think it's pretty clear that there are torture methods going on, things like that. And so people will do anything. They'll just say, fine, just take me, just put me behind bars, and oh, there's a conviction. Like, oh, one more person we caught with the Patriot Act, when really there could be so much that goes into that. I don't think that necessarily every person they catch was a terrorist with terrorism intentions.
Well, I think when we look at issues like torture, there's a common confusion between provisions of the Patriot Act and other policies of the Bush administration when looking at the liberties that interrogators are able to take with enemy combatants. Those are separate from what's in the Patriot Act. When we look at people who are held indefinitely at Guantanamo, on black sites overseas where torture may be implemented, that's not necessarily relating to the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act deals more with domestic issues, and there hasn't been any example or proof presented by any party to support the existence of torture
Yeah, I
in
don't
the
think
US.
they're going to, Joe Schmo's house out on the street, pulling him out and like sticking him in a basement and torturing him. I mean, they are, however, I think infringing on other liberties, like our right to privacy and the right to, private communications. And, with their wiretaps and other things, I think that can infringe on different sorts of rights, other, not necessarily torture, but.
And a lot of the provisions of the Patriot Act target the ones that are most frequently that are the most controversial, tend to target foreigners in the U.S. and not necessarily U.S. citizens. The restrictions on what the Patriot Act allows the government to do in terms of U.S. citizens are far more limiting than what they can do with foreigners. For example, a foreigner can be detained without cause, with no reason, for up to 7 days, and then even if he's cleared for release, they can still continue to detain him indefinitely. But that's something that doesn't apply to U.S. citizens.
Right, and that's why I think it's easier for some U.S. citizens to go ahead and say, oh yeah, there's no problem with the Patriot Act, we're preventing terrorism, because it's not infringing on any of their rights, because that would never happen to them, because, they're just, American-looking, American last name citizens that, wouldn't be targets of something like the Patriot Act. So I think it's a completely different issue when you're either a foreigner or you have an Islamic last name, and apparently that's relevance.
Well, the term relevance is just one of the biggest problems in the Patriot Act, is most of the provisions are justified by proving relevance, which is such a subjective term. Anything can constitute relevance, but in terms of making it like a racial profiling issue, I don't know how fair of an assessment that is, because, again, part of these being secret operations, we don't know how the racial issue has been distributed among people who have been questioned or detained. But when looking at like racial profiling and the issue of terrorism, you figure with the exception of the Murrah bombing in Oklahoma City in '95, every major attack against the U.S. Has been instigated by radical Islamic groups. So you walk a very fine line between, are we looking at, is this an issue of racial profiling, or are we looking at descriptions of suspects in the past and trying to draw reasonable conclusions about, who we're fighting, who we're targeting now. The most vehement anti-U.S. terrorist organizations right now are Islamic. So is it unnecessary to look at those groups, specifically look at people with Islamic last names, when you're conducting anti-terrorism
I think
efforts?
that's fine if they're going to look into people with Islamic last names if they actually have a probable cause, or, if they have some reason to believe that they might be connected to a terrorist, not just the way they look, not just their last name, because personally, I know a lot of people who have, after 9/11, the FBI shows up in their office building, harassing them, that sort of thing, really only on that basis. Truly, I know the people, it's really just that, you know what I mean? And the same thing with the eavesdropping, that's happened as well to a lot of people I know.
But is that inherent in the law, or is that just